I was certainly, for the first 5 years or so in Vietnam, cited as evidence for treason, of being unpatriotic and quote-unquote unsupportive of the troops. You know, in my own family when I was growing up in the 60s, and I was a teenager, my maternal grandfather had been in World War I and World War II. In World War I, he was in the army, and he was a ferocious opponent of Franklin Roosevelt. He hated Woodrow, and whenever the topic of war would come up, he would, say, these people were catastrophes. We shouldn't have been in any of these wars. My mother would argue with him. She lived through the Second War, and she said, well, we have to be supportive of the troops, and he would say, if you support the troops, bring them home. Well, of course, he was right. He'd been there in 1918. He thought the whole thing was a travesty, should never have happened. He was correct, but that's a long time ago, and there aren't many of us around right now. I remember as a child, he was explaining to me his great-uncle's experience on the battlefield at Gettysburg, where his great-uncle lost the lower left portion of his leg below the knee lying on the battlefield to be picked up by Confederate medics who then turned him over to Union medics, and he survived. That not many families are like that, and I grew up with all of that. So I always understood what the military was about. I understood the risks involved. I don't think that's widespread right now in the United States. So there's no easy answer. Now, one last point, though, to bring up about World War I. Remember that the British had almost, by European standards, no army. They had roughly 250,000, of which they could ship 150,000 to France. And that army was almost exterminated in the first few months of the war. I wrote a chapter in my book Margin of Victory all about the British Expeditionary Force, and the British foolishly thought that they would win the war in a great sea battle in the North Sea against the German Navy. Stop and think about that. Which never left the harbor, by the way, the German Navy. Well, actually, it did. It fought at Jutland. It did. They fought a major battle. They did very, very well, but they were never large enough to overwhelm or defeat the British blockade. But my point is there's a similar attitude in the United States that things can be managed and orchestrated from a distance, from afar, that putting large numbers of your own people at risk is unnecessary. That's what the British thought. Well, they had 800,000 dead from Britain alone as a result. We don't understand these things. Whereas we're as confused and deluded about military power as the British were. Because, again, we're an island. People don't get it. We're not a continental power. So, this is why I've argued repeatedly since the 90s. I remember having a wonderful conversation with the German Chief of Staff, a very wonderful man named Dietmar Strubman, and I said, Europeans have to have their own command and control. They have to take control of their destiny. He agreed, but he said, how do we get people to do it? Everyone was essentially punting, as we would say, the ball to us in Washington. Put your future in the hands of the Americans. I think we should be allies. I think we should be supportive of each other. But turning everything over to us, I think, was and is a mistake. We are both synchronically dressed in black, which adds to the gloomy atmosphere of our discussion. So I cannot let you walk off, Colonel McGregor, without a last attempt to find the silver lining at the horizon. Where's the beam of hope? Where's the source of optimism that you see? Where's, this silver lining? The light in the dark. Do you see one? I don't see how you remove the current ruling class in Washington from power soon enough to make any difference. That's the problem. I just don't think you'll have more success removing your problem children from power in Europe because, of course, you have a parliamentary system in most cases, the exception, of course, being France. We don't, and we have what we've got until there's another election. I suspect, or there's another kind. Who knows? But the bottom line is that I wish I could give you a more optimistic assessment at this point, but I can't. I have to read the so-called tea leaves as I see them, and that's what I see right now. And I think it's the culmination of all the various influences that I described. And remember that people like me are condemned routinely in the United States for our quote-unquote isolationism. But it was isolationism, if you want to call it that, which is misleading because we did business with everyone in the world. This is long before the regime of sanctions. And that was our goal. Our goal was, as Washington put it, to be the world's engine of economic prosperity, not to invade other people's countries. We lost our way. World War I was the beginning of that, and we've never regained it. That's the best that I can tell you. Hopefully, something will change that. But in the near term, I am not optimistic. So let's rebrand the word isolationism in a more positive-sounding way. Leave the people alone from time to time, or try to. This is how I would interpret your argument to prevent the Third World War. There have to be voices in politics who start to put pressure on these belligerents and say, okay, let's cool it off. Let's cool it down. And this should be the United States of America. But unfortunately, even though you did utter some words in this direction, the pressure from the United States at the moment on Israel not to overreact is not there. But this will be the way to stop World War III, to put some flames out, to put some pressure on Israel at the moment. Would that be a way to avoid? Yes, I think if Eisenhower were to be summoned from the grave and restored to the presidency, this would all stop. Because he had a very vivid picture of the Second World War. He knew that our limitations were significant. He knew what the American people would and would not tolerate and what they could and could not do. In other words, he had a sense of limitations. Putin has a sense of limitations. She has a sense of limitations. We have none. Let's listen to Biden. Oh, come on now. We can support 2 world wars at once. We have a $33 trillion national sovereign debt. We've exported our manufacturing base overseas. Not because the Chinese took it, but because we saw benefit from shipping it out and making money in our elite classes. And we've opened our borders and let anybody in, and we've stopped enforcing our laws, and criminality is raging out of control. But we're the greatest nation in the world. There's nothing we can't do. This is, to put it politely, insane. It's foolish. We need to get a grip on reality. I think we'll end up getting it, but it's going to be a rough route. Well, Colonel, this brings me to the absurd conclusion that the last hope of the West is Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. They probably lost more, you know. We've got to get out of this habit of condemning people who are different from us. Yeah, they may be culturally different. They may have a different political system. They may have values. In fact, most of them do. That doesn't make them wrong, and it doesn't make us right. It doesn't make them bad, and it doesn't make us better. So, treating the world with some degree of mutual respect instead of pouring buckets of filth and abuse all over the heads of people that we don't approve of has got to stop. Europeans have adopted this approach. It needs to go away. Colonel, thank you very much. And I think for a lot of our viewers, when I say probably someday you should consider entering the political arena again to apply for the American presidency, because some reasonable and also historically grounded knowledge and realism is desperately needed. Many thanks for your time. Many thanks for your insight. Always a pleasure and privilege to talk to you. Sure, thanks very much. All the best. Thank you. Once you have been in combat, you have dedicated your life to the military, also to the star ties of philosophy, of history. Just in a very short point, what is the most important lesson you took out of your military experience in the field? What is the most important thing there? It takes many years, usually a decade or two, to build an effective military establishment. Victories are won not on the day of battle but years before with decisions regarding equipment, most important decisions about how to fight and who should command. Those things are determined long before the war begins, and you have to understand the impact of those decisions and what you can and can't do. That brings us back to the sense of limitations. We tend to think in terms of, well, we'll go over here and fight these people. Why not consider the possibility that if you cannot be certain that you can win, don't fight?